Harriman. This is our first event of the semester, so we're very excited to have such an important speaker today. I'd like to thank Elise Giuliano for putting this together. I don't know where Elise is, but thank you so much for helping put this together. Our event today is going till 4:30. We have to stop at a sharp 4:30 because our speaker has a very busy. Oh, there's Elise. Thank you. You just received the thank you. Yes. The topic of our discussion today is dilemmas of national security and freedom of religion in wartime Ukraine. Our speaker is Oxana Shevel, who is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and director of the Tufts International Relations Program. Her research and teaching focus on the post-communist region, especially Ukraine and Russia, and topics such as nation building, identity, citizenship and memory politics, church-state relations, and democratization processes. She is co-author with Maria Popova of a book on the root causes of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, which came out in 2024. Her earlier book, Migration, Refugee Policy and State Building in Post-Communist Europe, which came out in 2011, won the American Association of Ukrainian Studies Prize for the best book in the field of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. Shevel currently serves as the Vice President and President-elect of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and as Vice President of our Association for the Study of Nationalities, ASN, which of course is held here at Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming Oksana at Columbia University. Yes.
Thank you very much, Marco, for this introduction, and thank you and Elise for inviting me. Elise, I'm going to follow you too. Marco was saying that we have to edit 4:30 sharp. If that's the case, that's fine. But if that's not the case, I'm happy to think more questions. So follow your lead. So the topic of my talk today is dilemmas of freedom of religion and national security in wartime Ukraine. I'm going to sort of try to do a few things here. I talk fast, so bear with me. But maybe that's an advantage because I can get through more stuff. So I'm going to start very briefly for the benefit of those who may not know a lot about Orthodox politics in Ukraine. Very brief kind of setting up the stage, what intra-Orthodox competition and kind of the relationship between politics and religion had looked like in Ukraine after independence until Euromaidan, and then in what ways first the Euromaidan and subsequent start of Russian aggression and the formation of a new Orthodox Church in Ukraine at the end of 2018 changed the political and religious landscape, and then in what ways the February 22 full-scale invasion further kind of changed things dramatically. I call these two events critical junctures in sort of the trajectory of church-state relations in the post-Soviet period. And ultimately, after the full-scale invasion, Ukraine declared its goal, the so-called, the term used, spiritual independence. So the war is increasingly being cast, not just the war for sort of political sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, but also for spiritual sovereignty. And in that quest, the state took a variety of measures. I'm going to go through most important ones. Against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is allegedly still retains links with the Russian Orthodox Church. And that is where sort of the dilemma comes in, because as I will try to unpack in the talk a little bit, the norms, international norms on the freedom of religion are such that it is very difficult for a state to make a case that would satisfy international legal experts that the measures against a particular religion are in fact warranted and justified, but this is exactly what the Ukrainian state is trying to do. So I'll put the Ukrainian case also a little bit in a comparative perspective, because although for very different reasons, but similar tension does exist in other European democracies in particular. And it's sort of interesting to see differences and similarities. And I will, I should say that this is a work in progress. So the conclusions are very tentative at this point, and I certainly welcome all and any feedback on the content and kind of the general thrust of what I'm talking about. So again, just by way of very, very brief history, Ukraine is a country with, okay, I'm actually going to put it also in a second without turning all the way. So Ukraine is a multi-religious country. There are many different denominations. It has very high level of religious pluralism, but still the majority of population, 70% give or take, that has been more or less constant, in surveys identify as being Orthodox. And then since the beginning of post-independence period, essentially And this is kind of what makes Ukraine different from most other Orthodox countries. Instead of there being just one Orthodox church in Ukraine, there had been three competing Orthodox churches. The names sometimes can be confusing because they all have Ukrainian Orthodox and Church in the title with different combinations and different traditions, but they're very different. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which used to be often called and still sometimes is called the Moscow Patriarchate, the church itself now very much resents this addition, even though they sometimes used it themselves historically. Is and has been until 2018 the only so-called canonical church, meaning it was the church recognized by the global Orthodoxy. Its roots go back to we can say in the 17th century when Moscow received authority over Kiev Metropolitanate from the Constantinople Patriarchate. So this church has been a part essentially of Russian Orthodox Church. In early 90s, the church received substantial autonomy through an edict of then Patriarch Alexei, but it still retains substantial links, and it is not recognized by the global Orthodoxy as a separate church, but is considered a part of the Russian Orthodox Church, kind of in this ecclesiastical terms. Now, religion and politics have been very closely tied in Ukraine, sort of the second point I want to emphasize here. So in my opinion, it is really impossible to talk about sort of church affairs without bringing politics back in. And historically in Ukraine, the quest for political sovereignty went hand in hand with a quest to try to establish an independent Orthodox Church. And in the early 90s, these attempts culminated in the formation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate. For reasons I'm not going to go into this talk, there is a lot of kind of history and books written about it, how it came about. But they basically, the leadership of this church kind of cast itself as separate from Moscow, but the split was not recognized by the global Orthodoxy as sort of legitimate split, and the church therefore was considered schismatic and not recognized by the fellow Orthodox churches as legitimate in the ecclesiastical terms. And the same can be said about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was the smallest of the three churches. It goes back, its history goes back to the early 20th century, an unsuccessful attempt at establishing independent Ukrainian state after the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, and this church then retained influence and kind of survived in the diaspora, came back to Ukraine at the end of communist period and has been the smaller one. So the UOCMP, Moscow Patriarchate, has been the largest one, Kiev Patriarchate, and the autocephalous one were the smaller, and both of these were not recognized as canonical. And again, sort of historically, this kind of quest for Ukrainian political sovereignty, especially for independence from Moscow, kind of orientation broadly to the West, or orientation towards Russia, manifested itself in these religious splits. And we can say, again, not something I'm going to go to in great detail, but if we look at different, say, presidents of Ukraine since 1991, we could sort of, generally speaking, the story is often much more complex. They would lean, so to say, more toward kind of Moscow-oriented church as opposed to these, the churches that were not oriented towards Moscow. So, with Kravchuk kind of more supporting and leaning towards Kiev Patriarchate, Kuchma originally being sort of more oriented towards Moscow Patriarchate, but there has been some variation. Yanukovych clearly very much with the Moscow Patriarchate, Yushchenko very much not with it, right? And then sort of that has been more or less the kind of ebb and flow of political competition and religious competition in Ukraine up until 1991. I should just, again, by way of very brief background, sometimes sort of people think that this, you all probably heard about the East-West Ukraine divide that, many scholars have argued existed in Ukraine, even though, again, there has been a lot of nuance and various disagreements as to where this divide was really real and was it really binary and where the border lie. But the important thing to highlight about the church, that it would be very simplistic to say that, say, the church that has been affiliated with Moscow has been more kind of East Ukrainian church, and the Kiev Patriarchate and the autocephalous were more like West Ukrainian churches, because in reality, as you can see on this map, of course, there are, Greek Catholics in Galicia. I don't think this, but this region in the West, that's the predominant territory where Ukrainian Greek Catholic, yet another church that also has, in some sense, Orthodox tradition is predominant. But what this map shows, that really it is kind of central and north central Western Ukraine, where population is more religious than population in the east of Ukraine. So yes, so it's fair to say that in the east of Ukraine there has been, greater kind of number of the Moscow Patriarchate churches, but it's also the region which is less religious, kind of generally speaking, and really the majority and believers, and that's where the competition between the churches would be most fierce. At these darker shaded areas where there were more parishes because of the more religious population. Now, so moving on to the Euromaidan and in what way it was a critical juncture. So this sort of like, the two churches that were considered schismatic by the global orthodoxy being sort of less oriented towards Moscow, and the one that was officially recognized by global orthodoxy being more oriented towards Moscow, has been the case since 1991. And when really things come kind of to, in some way, a climax, is the period Euromaidan and after, because already in the Euromaidan, during Euromaidan, and then during subsequent beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine, the churches took quite different positions. So the Kiev Patriarchy and the Orthodox Church unequivocally supported the protesters. They condemned Russian invasion. They called it, the war. They condemned annexation of Crimea. And Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy took a more nuanced position. They called for peace against violence, but they refrained from calling Russia the aggressive state. They refrained from, calling the war like the Russia war. Instead, they talked about fratricidal war, civil war in Ukraine. And that led, this picture, for example, shows there were various incidents that each one could be debated, but here what it shows, you can see the two hierarchs sitting down, even all other people are standing. This was an incident in the parliament of Ukraine after 2014, when names of the soldiers who died fighting Russian forces and separatist forces in Eastern Donbass were read by the president kind of to honor them. And the hierarchs from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church refused to stand up. So again, they had various explanations as to why. But this was sort of these kind of instances. There were instances of this church refusing to perform last rites for Ukrainian soldiers killed again fighting Russian forces. And that led to this growing perception among the population. I'm going to show a few polls in a minute to illustrate that this church really was not a Ukrainian, but a Russian or pro-Russian church. And that became kind of increasingly problematic and led to increasing tensions within society after Euromaidan, right? So it was sort of kind of always there in the background, and there was an ebb and flow to this conflict. But really, after Euromaidan, this position becomes increasingly hard for the church to kind of, that we are neutral, we are generally for peace, but we are not sort of taking sides in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That became increasingly problematic. President Poroshenko, who was in office from 2014 to 2019, really took on this cause of Ukrainian spiritual independence. And this is also was the time period when this third, we should say the fourth, but really now it's just two, Orthodox Church of Ukraine was formed, which is called not the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Right? I think actually I now myself made a mistake. So it's okay. Or yes, okay. You see, like I've been like in it, and I still can't keep the name straight. But so what basically happens, it is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchy, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, and just two hierarchs from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy come together in this unification council at the end of 2018. They formed this new church, and then with substantial sort of diplomatic effort from Ukrainian government, in particular President Poroshenko himself, the Ecumenical Patriarch agrees to recognize this church as a legitimate Orthodox church. So in other words, the Patriarch essentially goes back to the 17th century. He cancels the edict of his predecessor that gives Moscow authority over Kiev Metropolitan, basically brings Ukrainian territory back under the authority of the Constantinople Patriarch as it was before 17th century, and then says that, now that they're forming this new united church. At the time, there was some hope that all of the three churches would come together, but Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch refused to join Unification Council. Just two of their bishops joined. So sort of unity of Orthodox Church doesn't happen, but the competition changes because now there are these basically two churches, and both considered to be legitimate, although again, there is a debate, not only four Orthodox churches, I think, formally recognized the new church. In Russia, that was considered to be a matter of grave, not just religious, but political significance. There have been leaked tapes of Patriarch Kirill, essentially trying to convince the Patriarch in Constantinople not to do this, repeating all of these things that we've heard from Putin, how Ukraine is not a real country and all of these things. But be it as it may, sort of political climate was both in Ukraine domestically and geopolitically such that finally a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was independent from Moscow and was recognized as legitimate, at least in part of the global Orthodoxy, including the Ecumenical Patriarch himself, came into being. Now, it is often, especially in kind of pro-Russian narratives, you hear that this church was purely the creation of Poroshenko, that it was his political project and kind of nothing to do with Ukrainian people and even against their wishes. I think that would be inaccurate, and we can actually see that. This is the point that I was trying to make, that substantial changes happen in Ukraine in societal attitudes after Euromaidan. And these changes in attitudes in the religious sphere really mirror and parallel changes on all other, anything from support to NATO, support to the EU, to support for Ukrainian language, to negative attitudes for Russia. So Euromaidan serves as a watershed for all of these changes. And we can see here in this support for different churches, according to Razumkov Center polling. So this is support among people who self-identify as Orthodox. And then when they're asked which of these competing religious confessions they belong to, we see, very clear dynamics. Sort of OCU is formed in 2018, but even see for the UOC, Moscow Patriarchy and the Kiev Patriarchy, kind of the trajectory after 2013 begins to diverge, right? So fewer people, even before the formation of this new church, say that they are self-identifying with the Moscow-affiliated church. More people are identifying with the Kiev Patriarchy. And also very importantly here, there is a huge numbers. You can see people who say that they're just Orthodox, right? This is very interesting phenomenon in Ukraine. So people who are explicitly saying, I do not sort of avail myself to any of the competing Orthodox institutions. I can, if there are any questions about it, I can go a little bit more deeper into this, but I should say that as a political scientist, this has not been the focus of my research, but there is ample, very interesting, very important research done by sociologists, anthropologists, Catherine Warner, who may have been through here given talks as well, attorney Kemetravelli, who really kind of dig in what it means, for the attitudes, for lived, they call it lived experience, lived Orthodox. So it's really kind of diversity of the views of people who self-identify as Orthodox, and this kind of this group, this institution that doesn't affiliate themselves with either, is an important sociological phenomenon, right? So, okay, so to go, to continue with sort of background / post-Euromaidan developments, the period from 2018, late 2018, when this new church is formed, and early 2019, when it receives Thomas of Cephalid from ecumenical patriarch, which makes it, legitimate in the eyes of global orthodoxy, until Russian full-scale invasion, has sort of several interesting dynamics, and maybe some puzzling absence of changes in the way. So this conflict over parishes, so essentially once this new church was formed, although the process begins even earlier, many individual parishes want to reaffiliate from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the newly formed OCU. This process is incredibly contested. The OCU, of course, is in a way glad to receive the new parishes, but the Moscow Patriarchal Church claims that these attempts are illegal, that it's not, the people are not really believers of voting. Again, not something I'm going to go to in great detail in this talk. I actually wrote the whole separate paper just on this battle of the parishes in that time period. If anybody's interested, you can email me. I would be glad to send you a copy. But this was sort of, how the Orthodox competition, intra-Orthodox competition has been playing out in this time period. And of course, the change from Zelensky from Poroshenko to Zelensky was an important one, because Poroshenko fully embraces this notion that in the Ukrainian independence has to have a spiritual independence component. Ukrainian Orthodox Church, independent from Moscow, is absolutely critical for Ukrainian sovereignty. He was very instrumental in the diplomatic front of making this happen, right? And Zelensky really campaigns as kind of very distant from religion. He himself is not religious. He's a secular Jew. He is, sort of in the campaign is kind of the opposite of what Poroshenko is doing. So he's not emphasizing any of these things. Poroshenko runs with a slogan, army, language, face, right? He loses elections. And in a way, there has been some, hope or fear, depending who you ask, that with Zelensky taking office, things will change, right? So in other words, that he maybe will be again, as say Yanukovych before him, kind of put the state authority and state support very clearly in favor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy, that, things will become very different, but they actually don't, which is also quite interesting. I have some thoughts sort of as to why, but again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to focus on this. And then we are now at the Russian invasion. So this period happened, from 2018, 2019 until the full-scale invasion. we don't really see after these major events of 2018, 2019, any sort of major changes, even despite the change in the presidency, this ongoing conflict over parishes. And then, of course, Putin launches his full-scale invasion. And here, the church becomes very, very instrumental because the Russian Orthodox Church, being so closely tied to the Russian state, fully endorses this invasion. Patriarch Kirill says that soldiers who die fighting Ukrainians, they go to heaven. The war washes their sins. The World Russian People's Council, headed by Kirill, adopts this declaration calling the war against Ukraine a holy war. So this kind of synergy and full-throated support by the Russian Orthodox Church for this war really puts in a pickle the position of the Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy. This sort of makes this kind of, we are neutral, we are not really supporting either side, untenable. And we begin to see some movement on the part of the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to distance itself from the Russian church. So from the very beginning of the invasion, the head of the church in Ukraine, Metropolitan Onufry, issues a statement condemning Russian invasion, which he has never done before. So that was admittedly a big change. But still, many believe in Ukraine that not enough was done. Not enough has been done. There is continued commemoration of Patriarch Kirill. There is no sort of changes in the documents that define the church as essentially a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. There is grassroots movement within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for greater separation from Moscow. There are various letter writing campaigns. So again, kind of goes to show that the church is not homogeneous. Certainly kind of lower level clergy and the parishioners, of course, are not pro-Russian, or certainly not all of them, but the leadership still so they make certain steps, but they don't make enough steps in the eyes of many in society. Additionally, there were these repeated sort of allegations of collaboration between USC priests during the Russian occupation. And what all this leads to, it leads to that by the end of 2022, so it doesn't happen immediately, but by the end of the first year of the invasion, it seems that the highest echelons of Ukrainian government, including President Zelensky himself, essentially embraced this idea that, yes, we do need to push for spiritual independence, that the continued affiliation between this church in Ukraine and the church in Russia is really problematic on all sorts of levels. I'm going to talk about shortly about specific kind of allegations and claims the state put against the church. And here is, this the address of Zelensky from the beginning of December 2022, when he says, we will ensure spiritual independence, never allow anyone to build an empire inside the Ukrainian soul. So if you sort of bring political science literature here, this is, the ontological security. Security is defined not just purely in material and military terms, but also security as, spiritual security. And this is, concept inherently fuzzy, but it's important kind of to acknowledge that there has been this change, and sort of the fact that Zelensky, who campaigned against Poroshenko, who ran with the slogan, essentially embraces the same rhetoric, is very telling as to how far Ukrainian political spectrum has moved following the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion. So what exactly are the complaints that the Ukrainian state has against the Ukrainian church? Briefly speaking, I think it is possible to try to group the types of complaints that the state has made in sort of three buckets. Right. On the one hand, there are clearly sort of political/administrative complaints, the allegations that the church formally retains links with Russian Orthodox Church, and these links need to be severed. So this goes to the examination of the church statutes, references to the edict of Patriarch Alexei from 1990, where Ukrainian church is defined, even though it was having broad degree of autonomy, still a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. The hierarchs of the Ukrainian church are members of the Holy Synod of the Russian church. There are basically all of these administrative links, and the state says this can be, these links need to be separate. And I'll talk about kind of the church position, church response to this in a minute, right? Now, additionally, and this is sort of where it gets even more fuzzy in a way, because at least administrative link, you can sort of say like, the text says this, the text needs to say that. But here there are these additional kind of ideological/spiritual contentions that because of these sets of kind of beliefs and messaging that the church propagates, in particular, this ideology of Ruski Mir, which ultimately contends that it is God's will, that it is divine will for Ukraine and Russia to be together. And this sort of messaging goes kind of to the heart of spiritual security in Ukraine, right? So if there is a message that essentially, God wills for Ukrainians and Russians to be together, then like why we're fighting the war with Russia, right? Like you shouldn't be doing this, or God is punishing, Ukraine for not, following. And this, again, not to go into great detail on this, but there are a variety of sort of specific things that critics bring up. Anything from the type of icons that are being used in the church, for example, the emperor's family, Russian emperor family, that is a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. So again, if you are praying to a saint who was also an imperial autocrat who was against Ukrainian sovereignty, sort of how does that sort of square with the existential fight Ukraine is under? Then there were various elders, and there is this tradition in the Orthodox Church kind of thinking to the elders. And I started reading about the elders and went down the rabbit hole what these elders said. And this is really true what they said, because some scholars claim that the messaging of the elders, and these elders were basically the messaging, you have to stay with Russia. That was kind of the messaging of some of these serious elders that some politicians even considered their spiritual guides, including Yanukovych. But did these elders really say this? But anyways, this was sort of another kind of element of the spiritual messaging. Ukrainian language so it's thrown into this bucket as well, because the church conducts its liturgy and its sermons in the Old Church Slavonic, and has been very reluctant to use Ukrainian, to the point of arguing that language is unsuitable to talking with God. Right, again, sort of allegations, can you really be a Ukrainian church if this is your position? The church has all sorts of things to say how that is not quite so simple and maybe not even the case, but critics continue to claim that. And then sort of, the third element of allegations, or the third bucket of allegations, if you wish, are individual targets and individual accusations against various Ukrainian Orthodox Church clerics and hierarchs for various forms of collaborative activity. Ukrainian criminal code has been changed since the full-scale invasion, and various charges were added. I'm going to just show a few things here. So this is just an example of the kinds of things when they began to invest in security service of Ukraine, which, by the way, is also sort of became a pun, because it's Ukrainian, it's abbreviated as SBU, which stands for Security Service in Ukraine, but people now transcribe it kind of tongue-in-cheek as God's service of Ukraine, Служба Божа України, because it abbreviates the same way, right? So sort of that it's doing God's work. It's not so funny in English, but it's quite amusing in Ukrainian. So anyways, the Security Service of Ukraine began to do searches of various monasteries, religious buildings, and so forth. And then they would show the kinds of things that they find. And this is, for example, the findings from investigating one of the senior hierarchs of the church, Metropolitan Ionafan, who was convicted eventually on this investigation, on these charges of trying to overthrow constitutional order, inciting religious enmity, justifying armed aggression against Russia, who was exchanged to Russia and then received a medal, an award there from Patriarch Kirill. And he apparently authored, I don't know how many of you can read, but this one is called The Prayer for Russia. And it's all about, Holy Russia and how like Russia should be there forever and so forth. The prayer for president of Russia, like these kinds of things, right? Now, the question could be asked and should be asked, sort of how prevalent is this kind of thing, right? There are a lot of hierarchs, there is a lot of clergy, as Bill was saying, we're doing these investigations, we're finding these kinds of things. The statistics gives, room for skepticism, and the church certainly uses that. So here is, unfortunately, I didn't have time to translate it all in English, but then this article just came out about a week ago. So the SBU gave data to the journalists about the number of criminal cases they opened and number of convictions, and how many of these cases are against clergy and against senior clergy, and then the types of charges. I'll just translate for the benefit of those who can read. So the justification of the armed aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the first one, collaboration activity, the spreading the unallowed symbols and propaganda, state treason, aiding and abetting Russian Federation, the trying to take power in Ukraine, the smaller ones, and sort of threatening territorial integrity of Ukraine. So so justification of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, I mean, it really goes to kind of it's words rather than deeds, right? So again, these sorts of things that Russia should win, that we pray for President Putin and so forth. And again, if we take into account that there are more than 12,000 hierarchs or clergy in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and only about 180 criminal cases have been opened, I mean, it says like, well, it's just a few people, right? But sort of the retort to this is that, first of all, substantial number of hierarchs have been charged. Like if you look at the statistics, it's sort of close to half. And secondly, maybe even more damningly, that the church leadership does not really do anything about it. In other words, when the church retorts that there has been traitors in the SBU, in the armed forces, in the police, and all of these other government agencies, the state says yes, but then the leadership of these agencies basically condemns and disavows them, and you don't do this with the guys that we have found in your ranks, right? So the numbers tell part of the story. I think it should be important, it shouldn't be ignored, but there is sort of additional elements, kind of how does the church react to all of this. So to go in a little bit more detail before I get to the international standards and how they create, another dilemma. If we look at specific claims, so what is it that the state wants the church to do, and what is the church, how is the church reacting and responding, we see that they are really quite far apart. And now, in a way, reach the point, and for some time now, when the church simply just denies all of these things that the state accuses it of. So to start with the ties to remaining ties to the Russian Orthodox Church, the state had issued various expertises and studied the statutes and essentially saying in these specific ways, these ties remain. The church just says no. Like they held the council in May 2022, the Sobor, which is like the governing council. They changed the statute. They purged a lot of references to Russian Orthodox Church from the statute. And they're saying we have done enough. What was done, like now we're fully separate. And the state says no, because your hierarchs, various things, your hierarchs still are members of these governing bodies. They never resigned, never any formal letter of resignation or anything like this. You never notified any other church that you are now independent. No other church recognizes you as independent. And you did not purge from your statute references to this 1990 edict of the Russian Orthodox Church that gave you a status as administrative, sort of broad administrative autonomy, but still within the Russian Orthodox Church. You have to do more kind of on the administrative front. The church completely is saying that that's not true, and the government expertise are incompetent and or biased, and that just sort of, this debate has been going back and forth. Now, sort of additionally, there are very different interpretations, and here, we can listen to Tucker Carlson, all the others who have opined, and some of them have been paid lobbyists that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have hired with the help of some runaway Ukrainian oligarchs. But sort of presentation of this law that was adopted following Zelensky, this speech of December 1992, finally in April 2024, so it took a while, a law was adopted that essentially is often presented as a ban on religion or ban on orthodoxy or sort of ban on the church or ban on certain religious practices. That's really not accurate. Kind of, we can still debate whether the law should or shouldn't be there, but it is certainly not a ban on any church or religion. What the law does say, that the law banned Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It says that all Ukrainian religious institutions cannot have links with centers that are located in the aggressor state. So the law is much more sort of narrowly focused, not on any practice. It doesn't say, for example, that they should switch their liturgy to Ukrainian or they should change their calendar. There is also kind of politics around what calendar you call religious calendar. None of it is in the law, but it simply says that religious institutions in Ukraine have to make steps to separate themselves administratively from centers of influence, quote unquote, in the aggressor state, quote unquote, and the Russian Orthodox Church is banned in Ukraine. So if you are tied to Russian Orthodox Church, you have to change your statutes and to separate. Now, again, since the church says we already done it, we don't need to do anything else, right? That they are not essentially buying the law, right? Legitimacy or its messaging. They maintain pointing to things such as, of course, many Ukrainian people, servicemen who serve in the Ukrainian armed forces are members of the church. The church helps refugees, it fundraises, they have data on their website, like how much money they raised for the army and so forth. So their argument is that they are Ukrainian church. These allegations that the Russian church are completely misplaced, and the state is essentially on the witch hunt against this church. The clergy that has been arrested, they're all innocent, so there is no condemnation of the even people who have been convicted with evidence like Yanafan and others. Now, another kind of element in this discourse is that the Ukrainian state likes to point out how even though the church complains very vocally about persecution, quote unquote, by the Ukrainian state, it says very little about Russian persecution of their own clergy on the territories of Ukraine that Russia occupied. They essentially abolished Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The eparchies are completely, fully taken over and incorporated into the Russian church. Again, we don't sort of hear complaints from the church about that. The state likes to point this out. There is sort of double standard if you're talking about persecution. Like, here is your persecution of your own church right there, not to mention destruction of hundreds of religious buildings and shrines from the Russian bombardment and so forth. The Ukrainian church is very busy criticizing the Ukrainian state. Why is it not criticizing the Russian state to nearly the same extent? Now, kind of to say that we are in the process as it unfolds, if you are getting interested in this, is like, what happens next? September 30th, we're going to know more. Because literally, this is the next step in this sort of iterative battle between the church and the Ukrainian state. So after the law was passed, Ukrainian death stamps for state, how is it abbreviated in English? Державна служба для політики і свободи совісті. Help me out.
Свободи совісті.
State service on ethnopolitics and freedom of religion. I guess that would be the English translation. So they followed the process and the law. They arranged an expertise. An expertise said, yes, links exist. They sent an edict, this pripis directive to the church saying, these are the things you need to do. So there are very specific things, essentially four points. They're saying you have to, like, leadership has to resign from the governing bodies of the Russian Orthodox Church. They have to formally condemn the occupation of its eparchies, 8 eparchies by the Russian Federation and ROK. They have to there was something else. That they have to formally say that the statute of the Russian Orthodox Church does not apply to them. So these kind of formalistic things, the church flat out refused to do it. So they had 60 days, I believe, according to the law, to respond. Their response was, this is continued witch hunt. We already done everything that's reasonable. What has been asked for us is not reasonable. The law does not apply to us. We are not affiliated with Russia. We're Ukrainian church. We are not doing anything. And then the law says that if a religious institution refuses to sever these links that expertise found to be present, then the state has the authority, has the right to appeal to court. So this is what, next step. So just, I think at the beginning of September, a court case was filed by death, and the court date is now set for September 30th, 2025, so in about 12 days. Now, sort of interesting, just I want to mention, I was kind of trying to educate myself on what's going to happen next. Very importantly, that the church has like administrative structure, and the court case is against the Kiev Metropolia of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is sort of its governing center. And even if the court finds, which it very well might, in favor of the state, which means that this governing center will lose its status as a legal entity. So it's not a ban on conduct religious services, on proselytizing, on any sort of religious activity. It would be deregistration of this legal status, essentially would be lost by the governing center. What does it mean for parishes? The church still has some 12,000 by different counts, maybe less now, fewer parishes. They can still continue to function. They could function as independent parishes. They could affiliate with any other religious institution. There is, of course, a lot of tension and animosity. So the expectation of hope that all of them would switch to the OCU, I think, is unfounded. But it's basically not some sort of ban, again, on religious practice or practice of, whatever calendar they want to follow, whatever language of liturgy, but it would be the loss of administrative status by the governing center, right? So what is, again, sort of coming back to the point I made earlier, that the state and society, even though, as we'll get to in a second, international law may be much more critical, the state and society are sort of on the same page here. Again, there has been dramatic change in the attitudes in Ukraine towards Russia, and any kind of pro-Russian organizations, groups, forces, including this church. So now when, people are asked, and you can see here both from the national level and then by region, what should be the state policy towards Ukraine? The option that Ukrainian Orthodox Church should be fully banned in Ukraine is supported by substantial majority of the population. And then further, here that sort of middle ground that the state should not ban it all outright, but should control and oversee its activities, right? And the option that the state should do nothing and not interfere in any way and basically let them do their own thing really has a minority support. Now, I should say that it's always good to look at these surveys with a critical eye. And one thing that is important to keep in mind that depending how exactly the question asked, the answers would not be identical. So, for example, in this particular survey, the addendum Moscow Patriarchate was used. So instead of using the official name of the church, which is Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in the pollsters were asking Ukrainian Orthodox Church all the Moscow Patriarchate. And if the language in the survey omits the designation Moscow Patriarchate, the numbers become somewhat different because, either because people are more sort of free to express their opinion, and we don't really know, or because they think they're asking about the as a church. As I said, the names could be quite confusing. So I think the surveys, it is worth taking the surveys a little bit with a grain of salt and kind of be aware that these preferences are not set in stone. At the same time, the trajectory from majority of the Orthodox believers identifying this church to now small minority really supporting it is there, and the thing is undeniable. Now, so let me now move to the international law, and then we'll kind of see where does that take us. So the long sort of short of it is that international legal standards set very, very high bar for state action against the religion. So much so that both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, the European Convention on the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, the ECHR, and various documents adopted by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe for European states, all basically treat the freedom of religion as sacrosanct. And in the ICCPR and ECHR specifically, there is vocabulary in the text of these treaties that says national security cannot be used as a reason to limit religious freedom, right? So this is very important because sometimes when states even sign these conventions, they can derogate in the critical times when national security is threatened, they can derogate from certain obligations under the convention. But this particular obligation for the respect of the freedom of religion is non-derogable. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, which means that even at the gravest crisis in sort of secular sense, you cannot derogate from these obligations. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper into the text of these agreements, especially the OSCE ones, they have this policy guidelines. One is called Policy Guidance on Freedom of Religion, of Belief and Security, so specifically kind of saying what is and is not permissible as far as trying to protect national security. The bar is also very, very high, and there is an implicit assumption that very rarely, if ever, religion can pose a genuine threat to the state. So there are things such as, for example, saying that any kind of government expertise should be treated, should not really be done, and it really should be up to the religious institution itself to interpret its own text. So instead of government experts doing the expertise, the religious institution should do the expertise. Right, that things such as if say there is some danger that there may be some extremist attitudes, ideas, so forth propagated in the church. Again, the state should not send security service to see what's going on, but should count on the religious community to self-police. So there is this very sort of Pollyannish, almost kind of very sanguine view that this. And I'm not saying, I think this is really kind of, I keep thinking about it. I'm sure even in this room, there are probably different views as to is this the right thing, or maybe we should be rethinking this. But this is how it is now on paper, at least, right, in these instruments. So very, very hard. And then if the state is allowed to act against some sort of, religious activity for danger of security of society, it has to, the bar is high. It is violence or imminent threat of violence and calls for violence. So in other words, what sort of counts as extremist or threatening to national security? The bar is so high, it has to meet this, this vocabulary that is in these instruments, that there is imminent threat and there are direct calls to violence, right? And short of that, the state really kind of should defer back to the communities, religious communities, to self-police and figure out what's what. So again, very kind of democratic, we can say, very liberal, makes it very difficult for any kind of state to take measures that say it can decide for political or other reasons it needs to take to protect, be it security, be it values, be it any of these things that the government may care about. And the point on these three criteria, right? So even when the action is taken, it must meet these three criteria of proportionality, non-discrimination, and legitimacy. And again, some of you may be lawyers in this room or would be lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but having read a lot of these debates, including how the court cases from other countries, the sides in the dispute debate what is or is not proportional, what is or is not legitimate, what is or is not discriminatory. So the terms are put in the international law, but really the meaning of them is to substantial extent open to the debate. And if you start reading on these cases, you see that each side claims what they are trying to do is in fact meet this criteria, and critics will say, no, it does not meet this criteria, right? So that's very kind of important. And again, we see that, just highlighting that in many Western democracies, for the sake of time, I'm not gonna go like into, maybe just very briefly, just to give a few examples. So for example, this UN Committee on Elimination of Ethnic or racial discrimination and Human Rights Committee found that national security and counterterrorism measures that they employ the sweeping definition of what is sort of terrorist, what potentially threatens national security. And then the West European states try to do things that they justified in some sort of, security rationale, such as not allowing, for example, closing Muslim prayer rooms in the universities, all this debate about the headscarf and, religious head covering in France. It has to do with ritualistic slaughter of animals, which goes against animal welfare rights. So against some West European democracies try to ban ritualistic slaughter of animals, and even circumcision of male infants, which of course also important religious practice, for being again contrary to various democratic standards and principles that are central to the state. And you see these debates kind of, unfold in a way that the state says this is proportionate, legitimate, necessary. Critics would say, no, it isn't. And then the courts get involved. And sort of interesting to see, and I'm also going to signal towards the conclusion, how we see some of this in Ukraine. What often happens, at least on the limited number of cases that I was able to look at from different Western countries, that the outcome in the court disputes over these measures is not sort of full-scale reversal or one side fully winning, but basically these measures getting modified. So the state does not just defer to its critics or to international lawyers saying, oh yes, we made a mistake, we're going to roll it all back, but they argue back and forth, and oftentimes some sort of middle ground is found. For example, in France, they ended up not banning religious head covering in public places altogether, but did ban them only in state schools, and that was after like extended legal arguments in the courts and so forth. And there is some reason to think that something similar may be happening in Ukraine. I'll come back to it in a second, right? So, okay. So basically, just to illustrate how exact same debate that we see, well, obviously very different empirical details, but broadly speaking, kind of the outline of the debate is similar, meaning that just one of the discriminatory, and surprise, surprise, the Ukrainian state does not say so. Within a week of this report coming out, Ukrainian Foreign Ministry issued a rebuttal. They, have English text on their website if you want to read all the points, but essentially what they're claiming that the law pursues a legitimate aim. So to try to, at the time of war, to say that religious organizations operating on your territory cannot have ties with the aggressor state where the church endorses the war is a very legitimate thing to do. Right, it provides democratic procedure because the courts will get the final say. It is not some sort of arbitrary ban on the faith or the religious practice or the religious institution, right? And therefore it is proportionate, right? And the least burdensome. So again, they're referencing the same criteria in international law, saying our legislation meets this criteria. Now, it does not impose any burden on the conscience. So there is a sort of additional argument or strand of the argument to say it's not really about freedom of conscience, because there is nothing in the Orthodox faith that says you have to have loyalty to the Moscow Patriarchy and to Moscow Church. So you can practice Orthodoxy, right? You don't have to stop being Orthodox. You just have to sever your links with the Russian Church, and affiliation with the Russian Church is not a part of the tenet of the Orthodox teaching. Therefore, it is not about the faith. It is really about this institutional belonging, right? Again, we can go more into details, but I do want to save some time for Q&A. But sort of critics say that one argument that I would put forward with the critics, I think, correctly point out, that if really all the state wants to do is for the church to take these administrative measures and change its documents and sever the links to the Russian church, okay. But what is the guarantee that if they do this, any sort of their beliefs or the teaching that they preach with any of this change, right? You can do this very formalistically, and the same argument, in fact, has been made in Western Europe against the stringent integration requirements to acquire citizenship, when people have to pass a test and say they support gender equality. And like, some countries have this question, like, if your son married a gay person, what would you do, right? And if you are a Muslim believer filling in this questionnaire in order to get citizenship, and you'll say like, I'll welcome them in my family. You may want to kill them, but you're going to say you're going to welcome them in order to get citizenship, right? So the similar argument is levied, I think reasonably so, against this Ukrainian state position, saying like, if all you want is this formalistic requirement, right? Like, then maybe they can do it and still be a threat. And if that would be sufficient, doesn't it by itself means that they're really not a threat? I don't think the state has a good resort to this, but it's interesting to see how this argument plays out. But of course, the church itself is making it very easy for the Ukrainian state to say that, look, like they don't even want to do the formalistic thing, which they don't, right? But had they say agreed to do the formalistic thing, I think there would still be a discussion, do they really then separate it spiritually from the Russian world, Russia, and all of this? Now, last but not least, I want to highlight also that this issue of the future of this Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is very high priority for Russian state. This is something that has not really made it into the Western press all that much, because there has been all these attempts at negotiation and various drafts of peace settlement, and everybody's focusing on security guarantees and ceasefire, all the important things. But in the list of demands that Russia puts to Ukraine, the future of this church figure is very prominent, right? Even in the latest one, with the short memorandum of just 12 points, they are inserting removing all restrictions of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So they themselves believe, rightly or wrongly, that this church is really the last remaining institution in Ukraine that can channel sort of Russian influence, of power, and all of this, because everything else, political parties, TV channels, all of these other various instruments that Russia had for a long time to try to project its narratives, its soft power and hard power to Ukraine, have been shut down. And really the church, they believe is the last remaining one, which really sort of puts this church into the pickle, because they're saying that they're not, and yet they don't sever the link anyway, right? So you can see the vocabulary itself was interesting, because they, in the March 22, when there was this much longer draft treaty that the Russian negotiators were put into the Ukrainian delegation in the early months of the war, they themselves call it Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy, which they no longer do. But now they also got the name wrong, right? It is not Orthodox Church of Ukraine, it should be Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So they can't even get there. Nobody can get the name straight. But it is important, right, that this issue is not just about religion, but about politics, geopolitics, and really the future of post-war kind of situation in Ukraine, and to what extent Russia can or will not have this institute through which it itself believes it can make impact on the Ukrainian domestic political process, identity, and so forth. So just a few concluding observations very briefly, because I already talked about most of these things, right? So this notion that it was sort of the church, the independent church was somehow Poroshenko's pet project, I think really should be discarded, because yes, Poroshenko was very instrumental, but it was really kind of synergy between Ukrainian elites and Ukrainian public, increasingly due to the changes, domestic changes in Ukraine after Euromaidan. And again, after the start of the full-scale war. This international law setting such a high bar, and essentially implicitly and explicitly not even allowing for the possibility of a religion posing a threat to the state, is very important. For lawyers out there, for philosophers out there, I think the question is, or could be, to what extent we might need to rethink this, either this sort of principle in general, or perhaps for specific cases, or maybe not, or maybe then, if we do rethink it, we're sort of down the slippery slope, and any autocrat would say religion poses a threat. So even though current kind of premises may not be ideal, but they're better than the alternative. So this is something I've been thinking about myself. I don't have any answers, but I wanted to throw it out for the discussion, right? And then I think this twofold parallel with Western European democracies is important. So the one parallel being that just like in Ukraine, some elites in Western states do define certain religious practices or attitudes, behaviors as dangerous and threatening to the state and/or national cohesion, community values. Right? They run into the same obstacle with human rights groups, international UN watchdogs who are saying we can't do this. And then here comes the second parallel. Then it's not some sort of automatic autocratic decision by the government, because it is a democratic system, right? But it is also not the government simply deferring to critics saying, okay, I made a mistake, I'm going to back off. It goes to the courts, and then there is this very detailed debate about the specifics. And I think we are seeing that in Ukraine already, because, for example, one of the criticisms that the UN report from December levied on Ukraine was that the storm of Ruski Mir, Russian world, which was banned according to the law, was not defined. It was too vague. So the charge was that the religious institution doesn't know what not to do to avoid being charged of spreading Russian world propaganda. And the state since then adopted a decree. Again, critics may say the definition of Ruski world in this decree is not perfect, what have you, but at least sort of like that's kind of exactly the same dynamic we see in Western European democracies, where like the government says, okay, we're going to narrow it down, we're going to be more specific, we're going to tell you what specific kinds of things you shouldn't be doing, right? So, and I brought that here because I already mentioned, the war and scenarios, what Russia wants. I think that's again, if Ukraine is sort of forced to concede things to Russia, I think Putin will be pushing very hard for elimination of this legislation and these measures the state is taking against the church. Since given how Ukrainian political class is committed to spiritual independence, I think that they're going to push hard against it. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out. And on that happy note, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana, for talking about this, which is really a crucial component of this war, as you've shown us today. I'm going to open up to the questions now. I just have one quick one I'll throw in at the beginning. Do we know the fate of various churches in occupied territories? Like, what happens to churches that are not in Moscow, Patriarchate, in the occupied territory? What happens to the Greek Catholic Church, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? What happens in Crimea?
Nothing would happen. So this is sort of another thing. Essentially, everything that is not Russian Orthodox Church and Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy, they're simply taking them over. Right, and everything else, like the Greek Catholics, the Baptists, or various Protestants, like they are all persecuted. They're imprisoned. People have been, expelled. People have been killed. So, and there is, multiplicity of research on this. And again, sort of, the Ukrainian state officials would point to this and say, if anybody who's unhappy about freedom of religion, if you want to complain about something, there is something to complain about. Like there is a dire situation, you should be looking at that. And they're saying to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, you people, like your eparchies have been taken over, your priests are being forced essentially to join the Russian Orthodox Church, like you should be, complaining about that, which they're not. Sometimes they're making excuses, people have no choice, but I don't know, when you see, and I'm sure for some priests they have no choice, but I mean, some of them, they're like in the senior, in the Kremlin, literally celebrating annexation of Donetsk, of Kherson and Zaporizhia, when they did this so-called referendum. There were hierarchs from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who were there in the Kremlin, right? Like, so, but to your question, like terrible things are happening. So it is very high level of religious repression against religious institutions that are not Russian Orthodox Church.
And then the Ukrainian government is using these as an argument, even when they interact with the West, and then if there's with the West. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Questions? Yes, maybe identify yourself.
Оксана, дуже вам дякую. Дуже цікаву і важливу промову. Don't worry, I'll do my questions in English. The first one I'm interested in is, I know a lot of people in, who had been, believers and worshippers of Russian or the Moscow Patriarchy who have moved over to the other Ukrainian churches. And I just wondered, you talk a lot about the clergy, but I'm curious about what the sort of congregations look like now. What are their, characteristics? What are their demographics? What are their maybe age profiles? Are they overwhelmingly Russian speaking, or are the Ukrainian speakers involved? The other thing I wanted to ask was a little bit about the way this should be treated geographically, because you mentioned the court cases against the Kyiv Metropolia. Just for a bit of context, about 2 years ago, I was in Ukraine. I've worked a lot there, and I did a story where we went to Svetohivsk, obviously in Donetsk. And that is very, very weird, because when I identified a lot when you said, there's no definition of Ruski Mir. Well, we go in there and all the signs are in Russian. Everybody is just speaking Russian. They're talking to us about Russian history, not even in like a contemporary political sense, but it's like, it almost feels like Ruski Mir is one of those things that you know it when you see it, especially if you're Ukrainian. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how it's maybe being treated and how the churches are acting based on where they're located in Ukraine.
Yeah, your first question, I should say sort of, I'm going to disappoint, because as a political scientist, I'm much less sort of into the societal, like this sort of social attitudes thing. I try to read about it, but I haven't done any independent research on this. There is a recent article, or sort of a report But this guy, Andryczyk, you may want to look at it, or anybody else who's interested, he's a sociologist, and he basically did kind of like open-ended interviews with believers in some 12 parishes that have not switched, right? And sort of what do they think, like how do they think about current situation, that kind of stuff. And if I recall correctly, what he found, and again, this is admittedly like 12 parishes out of how many, right? It was more like open-ended interview, right? As opposed to some sort of very rigorous survey methodology. But what he found out that it really, the attitudes kind of run the gamut. So some people, and this goes to also Catherine Warner research on what she calls ambient faith in Ukraine, that they are just not really thinking about this broader politics at all. They like their priest, they have, connection maybe from childhood, like they're used to this church, they like the building, they feel at peace, and sort of they go there to pray, and that's kind of it for them, right? So they don't want to, or at least in the interviews with him, they did not volunteer any kind of political opinion. And what he also found, which was very interesting, because when these believers, and I should say that broadly speaking, they're more pious or more observant than adherents of the other church. So there is some statistics that the Pope Center collects. None of the Ukrainians are super religious, meaning like regular attendance to church is pretty low, but it is higher among people who say they belong to the Orthodox Church, formerly the Moscow Patriarchate. And they say, like, we like our Batushka, our priest, right? And we do what he says. So there is this culture of obedience. And again, it's sort of interesting to analyze it as both sociological and kind of political phenomena, because, maybe in the Orthodox, tradition in general, obedience is important, obedience to God and so forth. But critics say that this obedience is specifically cultivated, has been cultivated in the Russian Orthodox Church as sort of part and parcel of kind of, or maybe a mirror of Russian authoritarianism, right? And this notion that you cannot contradict the priest, right? He tells you what to do. It does resonate with people. And they would say, if our Batushka would switch, I would switch too, right? So when he was asking them, like, what would you do? Like, do you want your parish to switch? And they're like, well, we don't really, like, whatever Batushka decides, we'll go with it, right? So again, and I think the state is counting on this, that if, say, this court case does bend the metropolia, right, like the governing center of the Orthodox Church, so then all of these thousands of parishes that they have would basically have to make a decision. What do you do, right? Like, do you then either switch to OCU because you can't, for example, to own property, to pay your bills, to have an accountant, you have to have legal entity status. If you lose this, you can still pray, but it's very difficult to do anything administrative, like hire people, pay people, so forth, right? And given that these attitudes are really kind of in flux, they're not against Ukraine, many of these people are patriots, they would say they're Ukrainian, they're certainly not Russian, right? But they are kind of like the sort of this, this tradition of obedience and doing what Batushka says, he found that to be important as well, right? And then there is some of sort of the brainwashing. I mean, some of these canons that like there's only salvation possible with Russia, that, the elder, whoever said this and that. So there is also a subgroup of these people as well. So sort of the short, long answer to your question is that it's very heterogeneous. Again, I'm kind of reporting, this is not my own research, it's what I have been, trying to educate myself, that this church is very heterogeneous. So the leadership, I think fair to say, majority of the leadership, again, there are some exceptions, there has been this move by low-level priests, letters, still quite pro-Russian. But the parishioners and low-level priests really run the gamut. And maybe kind of, if you think, to the extent there is strategic thinking on the part of the Ukrainian state, maybe they're reasoning that if this change, legal change takes place, over time, a lot of these parishes would, maybe become even independent. You can still have your Batushka, you can still pray, maybe you just register as an independent church, right? Like, do you really need to be connected to some larger entity, right? And some of them might switch. I actually do have, I want to show, I wasn't planning on showing it, but this is an interesting slide. It doesn't exactly speak to your question, but it speaks somewhat. Because if you look at this, you see it here. You see quite a lot of, this is attitudes to specific provisions in the law, right? And they have really, you see like 38, 32, 39, like really quite split, right? So for all the other denominations say, should the propaganda of the Russian world ideology be banned, right? Religious organizations that, 38% of the adherents of the Russian or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy agree with this, right? So so again, like 32 disagree and another 30 say we don't know. So I think given this kind of heterogeneity within the church, I think, again, I can't say like what will happen, but I could see Ukrainian political actors knowing this, reasoning that, like if you sort of give a legal push, given this heterogeneity, the influence of Russian world, all of this pro-Russian priests is going to be declining over time, but it will happen I don't know, but that's, I think, interesting, because you see it as much more like one-sided in a way, right? The attitudes are much crisper in the other denominations, including actually interesting, the just Orthodox and the just Christian. They're now closer to the OCU and to kind of Ukraine average than to the, Moscow patriarchy, which is also interesting. So I'll leave that in case somebody else has questions.
I want to get a question in from our online audience. Frank Sisson's asking, how does the Genocide Convention apply, especially in regard to the ROC's abduction of children that would seem to be in imminent danger of genocide?
Yeah, I mean, again, the Russian, from what I understand, that the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia and whoever priests and hierarchs joined them and occupied Ukraine do play quite active role in this abduction of Ukrainian children. I think the Yale report, which just came out earlier this week, they identified some like 120 or some centers in Russia where this indoctrination takes place. Some of them are the monasteries and so forth, of the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't know. I mean, I think if that is the case, then I think the lawyers who are building the case that Russia is committing genocide could, it seems to me, implicate by association the Russian Orthodox Church in sort of being complicit in it, right? I don't know if that's being done specifically. And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church still has a lot of clout. This is not something that I researched, but I've been reading about it in this World Council of Churches. There has been pushed to exclude the Russian Orthodox Church from it, to expel it, because it essentially, it endorsed and blessed this genocidal war. But it hasn't happened. So again, there is sort of broader geopolitics, why is Russia still a member of various associations? There is kind of mirroring of that in the church.
Okay, thank you. Right here.
Hi, I'm James Nutter. I'm a postdoc here at Harriman. I wanted to return to the sort of last question that you left us with in the second one. And so it seems like there's this question about whether a religious organization poses a genuine threat to the state. And what I took from this talk is that in many cases, the threat is going to be something like soft power. So I'm a anthropological historian. I don't know this literature well, but I just wondered if there are like comparative politics frameworks for thinking about soft power that you find useful.
Yeah, I'm actually, because I had this a version of this talk submitted as an article in the journal, and I received some very good, but also critical feedback. And one of the things we're mentioning is exactly kind of to link it to the literature and political science. And apparently, and I just began reading about it this week, there is something called the Copenhagen School, which is part of the constructivist paradigm in international relations. And from what I gathered, they essentially were the first to talk about so-called ontological security and securitization of religion, right? Now, it is, I mean, again, I haven't dove deeply enough into it to say that I now know this literature fully, but to me, it sort of seemed like more kind of descriptive as opposed to explanatory framework, right? So they're saying when the state does it, they're engaging in securitization of religion, sure, like, can we say what is happening in Ukraine is securitization of religion? Absolutely. But it seems like there isn't really, or at least I haven't determined yet, if they are then saying, and therefore we should expect X, Y, and Z, or we should have everything, right? So it sort of more seems like explanatory, like descriptive paradigm almost, right, as opposed to explanatory, right? But I think to your question about the security, I mean, clearly, first of all, that it seems across the board, in Europe with this, supposedly Islamic terrorism threat, they argue endlessly what really is dangerous, not dangerous, right? Like what's extremist, what's not extremist. I don't think there will be kind of definitive answer to that. But one could say, like, is there at least a logic to the argument, right? Like, and I think in the case of Ukraine, you can say that, you can connect like sort of hard security, because imagine the hypothetical speaking, right? The Ukrainian official might say, and I think some of them probably think that even if they don't say it openly, like you go to church. In the church, you receive a message that, future and salvation is only with Russia, right? And here your state is fighting against Russia. Like, would you be less likely to serve in the armed forces? Would you be less likely to answer the call, right? Like, it's not unreasonable to say, like, probably, right? It's not sort of some fantastical scenario if you're a priest and you're a believer, right? And it's important what you're hearing. And they're telling you, right, the results is whole about satanical West and all these other things. So I think the link, maybe this is one way to think through these, given that it is very common, right? Like, are some of these claims that indeed there is a connection to security, kind of traditional understood, and certain religious practices, beliefs, institutions, maybe these claims are stronger in some contexts than others, right? And maybe when you're actually invaded by a neighboring country where the church says you really are part of our country, is one such example, right? And I think this is what Ukrainians are trying, this point that they're trying to make. But I don't think they're really succeeding, at least not with the international legal crowd, that are really kind of, into these norms, and they think that it's norms and we should stick to the norms.
Yes, Elise, what time do we have to leave?
Maybe I can take a couple of questions and try to answer them.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
I don't
but we can go a little bit over, right? I think, don't you have to go somewhere?
I don't,
Oh,
I'm following
yeah.
what Elise says.
It's up to you, you know,
Okay.
what you're about.
Well, we can get a couple more
I
questions.
have
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about financial, like financial ties between Moscow Patriarchate and Moscow itself. Like, was it proven that they were like because I remember I read it like in the news, but I didn't read any sort of like responsible and deep research on this topic. So are there like any proofs that there were financial transactions from this church to Russia? And can it be also used in this debate with international community, let's say with international law, that it literally they literally sponsor the war which is happening now, like against Ukraine?
Yeah, sort of the short answer to this is that there is no, meaning that there hasn't been any kind of smoking gun, finding, including by the searches, that there has been some sort of direct financial transfers one way or the other. What they do find instead are these sort of more indirect, like for example, all of this literature, that all this propaganda literature about the military force, it is printed in Russia for the most part, and then shipped to Ukraine, right? So somebody pays for it. Now, the church says, the Ukrainian church says, well, we received it many years ago, it was collecting dust in like some Kladovka, and then Isdom came and found it, and Isdom said, no, we saw it in the libraries and diocese shops, like you're clearly spreading it through that cash program. So to your argument, to your question, I think if they could document it, they would have made it public. I think it would, I'm sure they would use it in this debate with international lawyers. But what the lawyers would then say, given what international law says, then you have to prosecute individual people, right? Like individuals who received this transaction. So if you have like a priest who received, $10,000 from Russia, and then he, I don't know, printed some literature and spread it to the parishioners, go after this priest, leave the church alone. So I think even that would not still allow to kind of close the bar that the international law says. I think there was a question, but I'll take both. There's a lady from you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll take both, yeah, why don't you both ask your questions and I'll
Thank
take
you.
both.
I'm Anastasia, I'm a postdoc here. My question is the following. Maybe you noticed it while researching your questions. So it looks like the Ukrainian state is using all the recent changes, both in legislation and de facto, in order to terminate visas with the Russian or Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, like with Kiev Lavra, or just to keep them out basically. But then there were also reports that these precedents, when Russian Associated Church has been kicked out, were also used to reclaim these historical buildings by the state from Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And as the general level of religiosity due to war is declining, basically different churches, competitors of the Russian Church, are losing their property. Do we observe something like that? Like new reformation, basically?
Interesting. Yeah, I know a little bit about it. I'll tell you in a second what I know, but it wouldn't be an exhaustive answer. Do you want to ask a question, please, so I can try to answer those?
Sure, thank you. First off, name is Wayne Tibet, no particular affiliation other than being just with Ukraine. And forgive me if this might have been mentioned when I had to step out for a call, but there is an official letter filed by a group of UN special rapporteurs to the state of Ukraine. These rapporteurs are, I don't know too much about them, but independent experts that are allowed to file official letters at the UN. So it's not like some resolution that's been voted on mandatory. It was from May of 25. It makes some allegations about the government's prosecution / persecution of members of the church. So against functionaries of the church regarding seizure of property, and also against journalists and lawyers who are investigating the issue, like charges of high treason against them. Some of them do sound quite disturbing. In particular, there was apparently Metropolitan Theodosi of Czechoslovakia who suffered a severe head injury while that church was being violently seized in October 2024. I just went down this rabbit hole this morning. I don't know much. I couldn't immediately find any response to this letter. Question is, do you know about it? And the other question is, regarding, there's been apparent. It's not written about much, but there are reports of violent seizures of the church properties, in particular in Cherkasy and other in Frankivsk, by armed gangs. They're not identified.
Yeah.
And the question is, okay, who are the armed gangs?
Yeah, a good question. I'm gonna try to deal with both. So, Cecilia, on your question on the property, right? I mean, it is true that one of the things, in fact, it actually began kind of as a groundswell campaign, even before Zelensky made his first, spiritual independence talk in the late 92, already in the spring of 92. Completely kind of illegally, because local authorities do not have this right to kind of cancel leases and stuff. But there was this like, we are going to cancel state, because many of these churches function in the state-owned building, some of them of historical significance, and they say, okay, we're going to cancel the leases because, you have the Russian church, so forth. So and I think in a way, when they decided to adopt the national level law, kind of the hope was also to prevent this like ad hoc, like every, local municipality doing whatever it wants, right, to have this. But with the on this historical sites like Lavra and so forth, I think it is true that they are trying to, because essentially, it goes back to how different, even before Euromaidan, different political leaders at the highest level kind of lean towards one another church, and most of them lean towards the most of the church. And Yanukovych in particular, and Kuchma apparently also, according to what I read, during their tenure, local authorities were instructed to give a lot of property to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and to kind of prevent or put palki pelosa, as they say in Ukraine, to the Kiev Patriarchy when it was trying to acquire property or build resources. So this whole Lavra saying, like, the church is saying, and that in a way begins to speak to the second question, like, we are being deprived of this shrine where we have been for, that. And the state says, well, you actually received the lease in 2023 for free with violation of, and then you violated the terms of the lease because you engaged in commercial activity and you damaged some historical buildings and restructured them and so forth. So this is all part of this kind of polemic around it, right? So sort of broadly speaking, like, yes, I think they are trying to limit or kind of take back some of the state property that was transferred to the church. But sort of if one goes down to say, well, it shouldn't be happening, like how did the status quo came about to begin with, right? And the status quo also came with quite active involvement of the state. So I don't know more than that. I mean, I think again, a lot of these things is stuck in the courts. And again, it sort of goes to, say, how the court is going to be independent, are they pressured one way or the other. I mean, there has been some leaked tapes from the pre-Euromaidan period and after. Some of these judges were like notoriously corrupt, and there has been public knowledge. Literally bags of cash has been brought to the judges through a certain way and so forth. So I don't really have more to say than just like I guess my main point would be that yes, it is happening, but the status quo is not there, kind of neutrally independent. It arose also for political reasons. So if you kind of start to unravel the political chain, you get a certain picture. And if you just start looking at like, here was the status quo, and now it is being violated, and that's bad, and that's where the story ends, I think that would give one as the full picture, right? Now, on the second question about I am not aware of the specific group of UN rapporteurs from May report. I'm actually would appreciate if you have a citation or some link or something that I'll read about it. But just based on what you described, it seems again, it's sort of part of the same like kind of broader polemics that has been going on since 2022. So the church would say that the state is completely acting illegitimately and it is, taking out action, right? Now, what is missing in this story, I mean, it is true that I think it is absolutely worthwhile to look at each individual case and say, was there unjust violence? Should people who committed violence be prosecuted? And maybe these people were, from sort of right wing or whatever, whoever they may have been. But it is also true that the church from the beginning took a position that any attempt to transfer a parish was by definition illegal. That the parishes could not be transferred unless the priest agrees, unless the bishop agrees, and that went even against 1991 Ukrainian law, because 1991 Ukrainian law, freedom of religion, was very bottom up. It gave local religious community the right to change affiliation. So the law said, as a local religious community, as a parish, you are a legal entity and you have full autonomy. You can control the property, you can decide how to affiliate and so forth. But because the procedure was never spelled out how to actually change affiliation. What was happening, and I have a whole paper written about that of the pre-invasion period. If you're interested, email me and I'll be happy to share it. That the church essentially kind of mirroring what was happening in Russian church since early nineties, was changing its own statutes, putting the parishes under more direct authority of the bishops. And without the bishop approval, the parish couldn't do anything. And the Ukrainian state was saying this is against kind of both the way, the law and the democratic way of organizing religious life. So this is not to say that specific claims that these people may have brought in this May report aren't true. They may very well be true. But they contest and have been contesting essentially virtually any attempt, even when majority was voted, when the court said the vote was legal, they still contest these attempts because it's all considered as a legal seizure by territorial community, not religious community. So without knowing more details, like, yes, I heard about Cherkasy, it may very well be that the state is not doing what it's doing, completely, totally may be true. But given kind of that they are, again, dug their heels and saying any attempt to leave the church by any parish, by definition, is illegal. So that's another kind of side of the story. But I will be glad to look at this report with whoever it is. Yeah.
Question. I'm a student of journalism school. Curious, I know that the UN report focused on its objections to, sort of categorical banning of this church. I know you talked about the priests and the hierarchs who've been charged and in many cases convicted for basically treason and sedition against the state. And I know, so the conflict there is, I guess my question is, within Ukraine, amongst people who are in support of the defense of Ukraine against the invasion, is there an alternative to an outright ban of the church that has been discussed, that has any support at all, that's supportive of the defense of Ukraine, but also critical of this particular move?
I think if we look at this poll to the extent that we can sort of deduce things from the poll, I think this option, right, that the state should oversee and control activities, but should not ban the church outright. I think many Ukrainians do feel, and again, I should again repeat that the law is not banning the church. If you look what the law, it says it is not about banning any church. It's saying you have to sever your links with center of influence in aggressor state, applies to all the churches. And some, in fact, Orthodox, like there are various types of Orthodox, small Orthodox churches, they already did this. So it's not to say that this is like impossible to do. But the kind of the middle ground. So I think, yes, the ban on the religion does not sit well with many Ukrainians, right? And I think, again, depending on which poll, there was, for example, recently I watched, it was not published in the print media that I could see, but it was in one of these YouTube dialogue, whatever, like on these online channels. And they were saying that given that Russia is demanding that this law be annulled, right, of the church in the negotiation, could we compromise on this somehow, right? And, not in significant percent, I don't remember, it was still a minority, but it was like significant. It said that, yes, we should be able to find something around it, meaning that you're not banning the church, but you do want to prevent the spread of Ruski propaganda and so forth. And yes, there are, collaborators and so forth. So I think, and again, I guess the question becomes, because the state would say this is exactly what we're trying to do, right? We're not trying to ban the church. We're not trying to tell them like switch to liturgy in Ukrainian, change the calendar to the calendar, Western churches use. They're saying, write a letter to the Russian Patriarch Kirill and tell him, like, we don't recognize your statute. I, Onufri, the head of Ukrainian church, I am resigning from the governing body of this church. I condemn you taking over our eparchies. Like, do this, right? Like, is this too much to ask? Many Ukrainians would say like it isn't, right? So you don't have to, they don't like the idea of banning the church. And I think this sort of middle alternative, right, that should oversee and control what it does, I think speaks to that. So I think it is really would have been much, much easier if the church was more cooperative, because then I think when you try to search for a compromise, right, like trying to meet halfway is maybe the way to do it. But they really dug their heels, what your question. They're saying anything the state demands of them is either already done, not true, manipulation, persecution, gonienia, and all of this, right? So they are not, and it's not to say that there aren't people within the church who would be willing to engage. There is actually this group, it is called Sofiskaya Bratstvo, which literally means Sophia Brotherhood. It's named after the Sophia church in the 11th century church in Kiev. And it is basically some mid-level hierarchs, so like even lower level hierarchs, from the two competing churches that meet together as sort of like a dialogue group, and they're trying to exactly find out like ways to be more cooperative, right? Now, the problem is that because of the seizures, and conflict of parishes and property, there is so much acrimony now, right? That the leadership in either of the churches, I mean, I think originally the new church was really hoping that there would be some kind of unification, right? And in fact, if you sort of think strategically, had the leadership of the Moscow affiliated church been more strategic, they should have gone to this unification council. They were the largest group. They could have controlled the new church, but they didn't do it because that would have been an equivocal break with Moscow. Obviously, it would be to establish independent church, right? And they were not prepared to do this, even though Poroshenko personally was meeting with them and so forth. So, kind of this long-winded answer to your question that yes, I think the society is certainly open to things other than the ban. I don't think like the ban is what majority of the people want. Because again, support for democracy, then people understand that in a democratic society, like banning religion is not something to do lightly, right? But at the same time, I think the reputation of this church, because of its leadership, is so bad that people do buy into this rhetoric that this is like an arm of Moscow, that they are brainwashing people into this Ruski Mir, and something needs to be done about it, right? And if the church decided to be more cooperative, I think they could probably find even their own hierarchs. I mean, I don't want to go into the canonical business because I'm by no means an expert, but one of the arguments sort of the church is using, what supporters of the church is saying, that they can't really do these things the state is asking them to do, because that would make them schismatic, because the global orthodoxy recognizes them as part of the Russian Orthodox Church. You can't self-declare autocephaly because then you become schismatic, right? Like either you receive autocephaly from your mother church, and of course Russian Patriarch Kirill would never give autocephaly, he already refused in 91, like, they're saying you're one. Right, the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople already gave autocephaly to this, what was supposed to be unified church, right? So they're really in the pickle. So if they do what the state asks them to do, they become schismatic, and their whole claim to fame is that we are the only canonical church. Now, again, I'm not a canonic expert by any means, but I read at least one study by their own priest, priest meaning that he's actually a professor in their theological seminary. And he wrote the entire treatise of about 15 pages saying how they actually can do this. And he used the church canons, and he used certain clause. Basically, there is something apparently in the religious text or canon that says if the mother church descended into schism, then you can separate yourself from it. And he says an argument could be made that the Russian Orthodox Church descended into schism because they're supporting the war, so they sort of stop being a legitimate church, and therefore we can separate from them without losing legitimacy. So this is really going deep into sort of religious weeds that I don't want to go to, but I think.
Who wrote that? That 15-page report? Do you
Yes,
have
if you, I want to say Bortnik, but I am tired and I'm not exactly swearing that this is the, but if you can find it, email me, because I read it and I was like, I get it. I see that there is a way out for you people. Yes.
Okay, well, since we're over, I think 50 minutes or you still have things to do and you're getting tired, I want to thank Oksana for a wonderful talk. Thank you for all for coming.